In the previous lecture segment, I described the first three of the big five personality dimensions: openness to experience, conscientiousness, and extroversion. In this last segment, I'll describe the last two dimensions, agreeableness and neuroticism. I'll also discuss some personality attributes that go beyond the big five. Agreeableness is pretty straightforward. People who are agreeable are likely to agree with someone else's opinion to maintain social harmony, and they're likely to agree with a request to help someone else in their social group. That's the agree part of agreeableness. People who score high in agreeableness value getting along with others. They tend to be both trusting and trustworthy, and are generally helpful and cooperative. They tend to have an optimistic view of human nature. You'll get a high score on agreeableness if you endorse statements about sympathizing with others and feeling their emotions. And you'll get a low score if you say you're not interested in other people and their problems. If you score low on agreeableness, you might think that people who score high are just suckers, and you might be right. The last of the big five dimensions is called neuroticism. I really don't like that term because it sounds like it's the same thing as having a neurosis. Neuroses are psychiatric disorders that involve distress but not hallucinations or delusions. For example, phobias are considered neuroses. As I described in a previous unit, I have a mild snake phobia, which would be a neurosis. However, I'd score quite low on the personality dimension of neuroticism. So, don't confuse the personality dimension of neuroticism with the psychological disorders called neuroses. If you score higher than average on neuroticism, this doesn't mean that you have a disorder. So, what does neuroticism actually mean in personality research? Sometimes neuroticism is called emotional instability. People who score high in this dimension tend to react more to stress and negative events, whereas people who score low on this dimension tend to remain calm under stressful conditions. In personality questionnaires, someone will score high on neuroticism if they say they're easily irritated, stressed out, or upset. And they'll score low on neuroticism if they say they're relaxed most of the time and seldom feel depressed. A given person's personality can be summed up quite well by their scores along these five dimensions of openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. But this doesn't mean that someone's personality can be entirely captured by these big five dimensions. You're more than a combination of openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Think of it like this. Here's a high-resolution picture of the Mona Lisa, and here's a blurred version. The blurred version clearly resembles the high-resolution version, and it has all the major features. However, it's missing a lot of the details. The same thing is true when we summarize someone's personality in terms of the big five dimensions. We get a pretty reasonable view of what someone's like from these five dimensions, but it's a little blurry and we're missing many of the details. Personality psychologists have studied other dimensions as well, like authoritarianism and self-monitoring. Authoritarianism is pretty straightforward. It's the extent to which someone believes that some authority determines what's right and wrong, true and false. People who score high in authoritarianism tend to follow mainstream values and insist that everyone else does as well. As you can imagine, there's an obvious relationship between authoritarianism and Milgram's obedience experiment. You'd expect someone who has an authoritarian personality to feel that the experimenter, who's the authority figure, should be obeyed. In fact, there is some evidence that people who score high on authoritarianism are more likely to obey in the Milgram experiment. However, other personality factors may also play a role. Another dimension that's been studied intensively is called self-monitoring. This is the tendency for someone to adjust his or her behavior to the situation. Someone who's high in self-monitoring would be very serious and studious in a classroom, but might act wild and crazy at a house party. Someone who's low in self-monitoring would tend to act the same way independent of the situation. If you take a personality questionnaire designed to assess self-monitoring, you'll get a high score if you indicate that you laugh more when you watch a comedy with other people than if you're watching it by yourself, or if you indicate that you pretend to be having a good time even if you're not enjoying yourself. And you'll get a low score if you indicate that you can't easily imitate other people, or you can't easily argue for an idea unless you actually believe in it. Is it better to be low or high in self-monitoring? In some ways, the dominant US culture values people who are true to themselves no matter what the situation. And that's one way to characterize people who are low in self-monitoring. Think Katniss Everdeen. She's basically the same person, whether she's hunting in the woods or being interviewed on TV. If a person who is low in self-monitoring is basically a serious, studious person, that's how the person will act in both the classroom and a party. And if the person tends to be wild and uninhibited, that's how the person will act in both the classroom and a party. That's who the person is, and the situation doesn't change anything. On the other hand, someone who's low in self-monitoring might have trouble staying quiet in a library or a movie theater. In contrast, somebody who is high in self-monitoring will be more sensitive to the situation. Indeed, people who are high in self-monitoring tend to be better liked and do better in job interviews than people who are low in self-monitoring. But if you're low in self-monitoring, you probably don't care. You think it's more important to be yourself than to be liked by everyone. Authoritarianism and self-monitoring are just two of many different attributes of personality that go beyond the Big Five.